Don't know what this song, this is a long song. I'll sing it quick as I can. Okay. When I sit down, I sit on the ground, I sit on the ground, I sit on the ground when I sit down. If there's no chairs around, when I sit down, I sit on the ground, I sit on the ground when I sit down. If there's no chairs around, Unless there's a bench, there might be a bench. I'll sit on a bench, I'll sit on a bench, I'll sit on a bench unless there's a stench. And I sit on the ground when I sit down. But if there's a bench, there might be a bench. I'll sit on a bench, I'll sit on a bench, I'll sit on a bench unless there's a stench. Then I sit on the ground when I sit down. So I checked out the bench, There seemed like a stench, There seemed like a stench seemed to come from the bench. Before I sat down, I didn't sit down, I checked out the bench. I sniffed at the bench and it seemed like a stench, seemed like a stench seemed to come from the bench. So I sat on the ground when I sat down. If I sat in the stench, well, I'd rather not mention. If I sat in the stench, well, I'd rather not say, So I sat in the stench, It was not my intention. Since I sat in the stench, on the ground I won't stay, So then I got up, and I looked for the pup, I looked for the pup who caused the stench, where I sat on the ground, where I sat down. Couldn't locate the pup, even when I got up, Couldn't locate the pup, but when I looked around, a wench had sat down on the bench, not the ground. So I said to the wench, to the wench on the bench, I said to the wench on the bench, did you notice a stench on the ground or the bench or around? And the wench on the bench, didn't notice the stench, didn't notice a stench on the bench or the ground. But when I was around, then the stench was around. When my teeth I unclenched, and I cursed out the bench, but I did it in French, because the wench was around on the bench, not the ground, so I cursed out the bench, but I did it in French, I said, Merde foudre, and the wench went away. She no longer sat down on the bench or the ground. So I took out my wrench, I dismantled the bench, and I dug a deep trench, put the bench in the ground, put it deep in the ground, but there still was a stench, so my clothing I drenched, but there still was a stench, so that's when I stripped down, put my clothes in the ground. If you take my advice, you should take my advice. You'd better check twice, you'd better look twice. You better sniff twice at the bench in the ground, because there's stench all around. Yeah, there's stench all around. Better take my advice, you should take my advice. Better check at least twice. Better sniff once or twice. Better check in the bench in the ground all around. Better check in the air, it might get in your hair. Better check in the sky, it might get in your eye. Better check in your clothes, it might get up your nose. Better check in the bench in the ground all around, because there's stench all around. Before you sit down on the ground.